Night she showed up, I had a pot of coffee going and the back porch light on. Not because I was expecting her. I just keep the light on. Old habit. My father did it too. Said a dark porch was an unwelcoming porch, and whatever else happened in life, a man's home should never be unwelcoming. I've held on to that. 63 years old and I still flip that switch every evening around 5, whether anyone's coming or not. She stood at the end of the driveway for a moment before she came up the steps. I saw her from the kitchen window. She was looking at the house the way people look at something they're trying to reconcile with what they expected to see. Slow, almost suspicious. Like the math wasn't working out. I opened the door before she knocked. She said, "This is yours." I said, "Come inside. Coffee's ready." My ex-wife and I were married for 19 years. We raised 2 kids in a small house on Fenwick Road, the kind of neighborhood where everybody knows what car you drive and approximately how much you make. She knew everything about our finances because I trusted her with everything. That was the first thing I'd do differently if I had it to do over. Not the trusting, the everything. We split when my son was 17 and my daughter was 14. No dramatic moment, no single blow-up, just a long, slow unraveling that I kept thinking we'd find a way to stitch back together. Until one morning, she told me she'd already spoken to a lawyer, already had papers drawn up, and was I going to cooperate or make this difficult? I cooperated. I don't say that with pride, exactly. I say it because it's true. I signed what they put in front of me, agreed to a split that my own brother said was insane, and moved into a 1-bedroom apartment on the east side of town with a futon and a coffee maker and the feeling that I had somehow sleepwalked through the most important negotiation of my life. She got the house. She got the cars. She got the investment account we'd built together over 16 years, the one I'd been putting $200 into every month since her son was born, the one I used to check on quiet Sunday mornings like it was something growing in a garden. She got it because I didn't fight, and because I thought, genuinely believed, that doing right by her would eventually count for something. It didn't. Within about 6 months, I started hearing things. This is a small town at its core, even though it's grown. People talk. A friend of mine from the hardware co-op told me he'd run into my ex-wife at a dinner party, and she'd given him the whole story. Her version of it, and the version she was telling did not feature a man who had quietly worked 60-hour weeks for 2 decades. It featured a man who had coasted on her ambition, dragged his feet on every major decision, and ultimately had to be removed like a splinter so the family could heal. I heard that and I sat with it for a long time. There was a version of me that wanted to call people, set the record straight, show up at that dinner party and lay out the receipts, the tax returns, the paycheck stubs, the calendar I kept for 3 years, where I tracked every school pickup, every doctor appointment, every overnight shift I pulled so we could save the money to put our kids through college without debt. I didn't do any of that. Partly because I knew it would look desperate, partly because I was tired, but mostly because I had a feeling, not a plan yet, just a feeling, that the only thing worth saying would have to be said in a way she couldn't argue with, words she could reframe. Numbers on a piece of paper, a house she could stand in front of and see with her own eyes. That was different. So I got quiet, and I got to work. The apartment I moved into after the divorce was embarrassing, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Thin walls, a parking lot view, a neighbor who played guitar badly at 11 o'clock on weeknights. I was 54 years old and starting over, and there were nights I sat at that kitchen table and genuinely could not tell you what the point was. My son came by once early on, took a look around, and didn't say anything critical. He was too kind for that, but I could see it on his face. The calculation, the comparison. He'd grown up in a 4-bedroom house with a yard and a finished basement, and now his father was eating cereal out of a mug because he hadn't gotten around to buying bowls. My daughter called me every Sunday. She was in college by then. She had her mother's practicality and her grandfather's stubbornness, and she would ask me direct questions and expect direct answers. "Are you okay?" Not as a pleasantry, as a real inquiry. I told her I was working on it. I was. I had my trade, 22 years, as an electrician, the last 12 running my own small crew. I'd kept the business in the divorce. My ex-wife hadn't wanted it, had never wanted anything to do with it, called it my blue-collar hobby, in a way that used to irritate me more than I let on. I had 3 guys working for me, a decent reputation in the county, and enough contracts to stay afloat. That was the floor. I built up from there. I won't make this sound like a movie montage because it wasn't. It was slow and grinding, and there were months where I wasn't sure the math worked. I took on commercial contracts I'd avoided before. Bigger jobs, more coordination, more risk. I brought in a fourth guy, then a fifth. Started doing industrial work, which I'd always had the license for but never chased. Hired a woman named. I'll just call her my office manager, because she'd hate being named in a story like this, who reorganized the billing side of things and within 8 months had increased our collections rate by 40%. I lived small. I banked the difference. After about 2 years, I bought a piece of land. 11 acres on the county line, a long flat stretch with good road access and a creek running along the back edge. My ex-wife would have called it a swamp with delusions. I called it the right price at the right time and started planning. I built the house myself. Well, I built it with my crew, nights and weekends over about 14 months. I know that sounds improbable for a man in his late 50s, and maybe it was, but when you've spent 30 years in the trade, you look at a house differently than most people do. You see systems. You see problems before they're problems. You see where the previous guy cut corners, and you know how to avoid making the same call. We didn't cut corners. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a wraparound porch that faces west so you get the evening light, a kitchen with enough counter space to actually cook in, a workshop in the back where I put in proper lighting, and a workbench I built from scratch from reclaimed oak. Not a mansion. Not trying to be, but solid, quiet mine. I moved in on a Saturday in October. My son helped me carry boxes. My daughter drove 4 hours to be there. We ordered pizza and sat on the back porch and watched the sun go down behind the tree line, and my daughter cried a little, which she denied, and my son said, "Dad, this is something else." And I said, "Yeah," because I couldn't think of anything better to say. That was 2 years ago. My ex-wife reached out in the spring. Her note. She sent an email, which struck me as both formal and slightly cowardly. Said that our daughter had mentioned I'd built a place, and she was going to be in the area for a conference, and she hoped things were going well, and would I be open to meeting for coffee sometime. I read it twice. Then I read it third time, looking for the thing underneath it, the real question, the angle. I've known this woman for a long time. She doesn't send casual emails. My daughter, when I told her, said, "I didn't tell her to reach out, Dad. I just mentioned the house because she asked how you were doing." I said that was fine. My daughter said, "You don't have to see her." I said I knew that. I thought about it for a few days. There was a version of this where I said no thank you and got back to the rest of my life. There was another version where I said yes, and she showed up to some neutral coffee shop, and we made careful conversation for 45 minutes and went our separate ways. Neither felt right. So I sent her the address. I want to be clear about what I was doing and what I wasn't. I was not inviting her over to gloat. I am 63 years old and I have no interest in gloating. It's a young person's game and it tends to backfire. I invited her to the house because if she was going to form an updated picture of my life, I wanted it to be accurate. She had spent several years circulating a version of me that I found insulting. I wasn't going to correct her with words. I was going to let her stand in my kitchen and see what she saw. She arrived on a Wednesday evening in May. The first thing she noticed was the porch. I watched her come up the driveway. She drives the same car, a gray sedan she's had forever, and she slowed down more than she needed to before she parked, just looking. The house sits back from the road a bit, behind a row of oaks I've been slowly clearing on one side to improve the sightline. In the evening light it looks, I've been told, like something from a different century. Not old, just settled. She stood at the edge of the steps and looked at it for a long moment. "You built this," she said. Not a question. More like she was confirming something to herself. "Mostly," I said. "My crew helped." She came up the steps and through the door, and I watched her look at everything the way you look at a place you're trying to appraise while pretending you're not appraising it. The ceilings. The trim work. The kitchen. She ran her hand along the countertop, a piece of butcher block I finished myself, and didn't say anything. I poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them to the table. She sat down. She looked out the window toward the back field, which still had the last of the evening sun on it. She said, "It's quiet here. That's what I wanted," I said. There was a pause, the comfortable kind and the uncomfortable kind at the same time. She said, "I heard the business expanded." "Some." Your daughter said you have 20-something people now. 23, I said, as of this spring. She nodded. She was looking at her coffee. I want to say something, she said. I waited. When we split, the way things were divided, the settlement, I was not fair to you. She said it flat, without a lot of decoration. I'll give her that. She's always been direct when she decides to be direct. I let the lawyers push things in a direction I knew wasn't right, and I didn't stop it because I was angry, and I told myself you'd be fine, that you'd figure it out. But I also said some things to people that I shouldn't have, and some of those people, I know they're still in your life, and I just want you to know that I'm aware of what I did. I looked at her for a moment. I said, I know. She looked up. I figured it out, I said, like you thought I would. She stayed about an hour. We talked about our kids, our daughter's new job, our son's second kid on the way, a grandchild I am still getting used to the idea of and can't wait to meet. We didn't talk about the money. We didn't have a big reckoning scene. I have seen too many people wait their whole lives for a reckoning scene, and I wasn't interested in holding my breath for one. She asked to see the workshop before she left, and I showed her. She stood in the doorway and looked at the workbench, the tool organization along the wall, the piece I'm currently working on, a cabinet from my son's garage, simple but solid, walnut veneer on the doors. She said, you always were better at this than you let yourself believe. I didn't say anything to that. I just turned off the workshop light and we walked back to the house. At her car, she said, thank you for letting me see it. I said, drive safe. I've thought about that evening a lot in the months since. Not with bitterness. I want to be honest about that because it would be easier to tell this story with bitterness and more satisfying maybe, but it wouldn't be accurate. What I feel when I think about it is something closer to completion, maybe. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself, just settles in like the foundation of a well-built house. My ex-wife spent several years telling people I was a man who couldn't make it without her. I think she believed it when she said it. I think she convinced herself that the good years of our marriage had been built on her ambition and my luck. And when she was angry enough, she told that story to anyone who would listen. She stood in my kitchen on a Wednesday evening in May, and she saw something different. That was enough. I didn't need her to apologize publicly. I didn't need her to call the people she'd talked to and correct the record. A piece of me, a few years ago, would have wanted that. The version of me that was sitting in that apartment eating cereal out of a mug. That version would have wanted some kind of public accounting. But this version, the one who built this house, who got up at 5 a.m. for 9 years and made decisions and hired good people and banked the difference and put 11 acres on the county line to use, this version doesn't need the story corrected. The story corrected itself. My son asked me once, around the time I was laying the foundation for the house, whether I ever regretted not fighting harder in the divorce, not just the settlement, the whole thing, whether I wished I'd made more noise. I thought about it for a while before I answered. I said, I think if I'd spent my energy on that fight, I'd have won some of it and lost everything else. He thought about that. What does that mean? It means the apartment, the crew, the land, all of it required me to be paying attention in a forward direction. Every hour I spent being angry about what was behind me was an hour I wasn't building what was in front of me. He said, that sounds like something you read somewhere. I said, probably. But it's also true. The coffee maker in my kitchen is the good kind. Not expensive, but built right. There's a window above the sink that faces east, and on clear mornings the light comes in at an angle that makes the whole counter glow for about 20 minutes before the sun clears the tree line. I make my coffee and I stand at that window and I watch that happen. I've built a life I didn't have the imagination to picture when I was sitting in that apartment. That's the part that surprised me most. Not the house, not the business, but the imagination problem. I didn't know what I was capable of building because I'd spent 19 years building something jointly, deferring to someone else's vision of what our life should look like. When that was gone, the vision was gone with it, and I had to find out what I actually wanted. Turns out what I wanted was quiet, and a porch that faces west, and work that means something. And the kind of mornings where you stand at a window and there's nothing pressing on you and you can just watch the light come in. My ex-wife called me nothing. I built something from that word, not out of spite. Spite is exhausting, and I didn't have the energy for it. I built it because once you've been told you're nothing, the only honest response is to find out what you actually are. I know what I am now. I've got the house to prove it. I've had a lot of time to think about what those years cost me and what they gave me. And here's the thing I keep coming back to. The cost and the gift were the same thing. She took the house, the cars, the account I'd spent 16 years building. She told people I was the reason things fell apart. She handed me the smallest version of myself she could construct and sent me out into the world with it like it was a fact. What she didn't understand, what I didn't understand either, not right away, is that what a person does with that moment is entirely up to them. You can carry the small version, you can wear it like a coat and let it define the next decade. I know people who've done that. They're still angry in the same room they were angry in years ago, rehearsing the same arguments, still waiting for someone to admit they were wrong. I didn't want that room. It took me a while to figure out what I did want. That's the honest part. Nobody tells you that starting over isn't empowering right away. It's just quiet and a little humiliating and full of small decisions that don't feel meaningful at the time. Buying a coffee maker. Learning to cook real meals again. Getting up at 5 in the morning, not because you have to, but because the alternative is lying there thinking too much. What I learned, slowly, is that actions accumulate, not dramatically, not in a way you can point to and say, that's the moment everything changed. More like water finding its way downhill, steady, patient, indifferent to obstacles. I made one decision, and then the next one, and then the one after that, and somewhere in that chain of ordinary choices, things began to shift. There's a cause and an effect to how lives turn out, and it's rarely as clean as people want it to be. My ex-wife's choices had consequences she didn't anticipate. My silence, which she read as weakness, turned out to be the most useful thing I had. Not because silence is a strategy. I didn't think of it that way. It was just that I didn't have the energy for the fight she wanted, and so I put that energy somewhere else. Into the crew, the contracts, the land, the house. The house is the thing I'm proudest of. Not because it's impressive. It isn't. Not in the way people mean when they say impressive. But because every room in it required a decision I made alone, with my own judgment, and nothing in it was compromised to keep someone else comfortable. That's what I didn't have before. Not the house. The uncompromised judgment. My son said once that I seemed different after the divorce. More settled somehow, despite having so much less. I think I know what he meant. When you spend a long time building a life around someone else's vision, you lose track of what your own eye sees. Getting that back, learning to trust your own read on a situation, to make a call and stand behind it. That takes time, and it takes failure, and it takes a lot of early mornings at a kitchen window watching the light come in. My ex-wife said I was nothing. I think she meant it. I think it was true, in a way, at that moment. Because I had spent so long being half of something that I'd forgotten how to be a whole thing on my own. Rebuilding that isn't a dramatic story. It's just work and time. And the decision, made quietly and without applause, to keep going anyway,